We are born into a world already filled with invisible scripts, scripts that tell us how to behave, when to speak, who to become, and more insidiously, when we are allowed to begin. From the earliest moments of our lives, the concept of permission is wrapped into everything. We ask to go outside. We ask to speak in class. We ask if it's okay to feel what we feel. And although there's a necessary function to some of these early rules, safety, structure, guidance, somewhere along the way, the asking becomes less about cooperation and more about control. It becomes a habit, deeply embedded, that convinces us we must wait for some external force to affirm what we already know inside. We grow up carrying this quiet weight, the assumption that before we move, before we act, before we dream out loud, we must be told explicitly that we're allowed. But permission, in the way most of us carry it, is not truth. It's inheritance. It is a myth passed down through families, through classrooms, through cultures. It is a learned behavior, conditioned into us through years of subtle reinforcement. Be agreeable, be quiet, be small until someone more powerful decides you are worthy of the space you want to take. And if that person never appears, if the invitation never arrives, then we are expected to wait quietly, or worse, to shrink. This myth doesn't operate by shouting its demands. It works more dangerously, through politeness, through expectation, through praise for how well we've followed directions. We are rewarded not for thinking independently, but for staying within the lines, not for taking the risk, but for waiting our turn. And this waiting becomes a posture. You see it everywhere. People sitting on ideas they never speak aloud. Artists waiting until someone calls them talented before they make their work. Leaders in the making, who hesitate to raise their hand until someone else points and says, yes, you're allowed to lead. The truth is, permission is rarely granted in the moments when it matters most, because those moments, the moments where we feel called to do something bold or different or new, usually come before the world understands why we're doing it. And that's what makes them powerful. You will never be fully endorsed before you begin. There is no committee waiting to send you a letter of approval for choosing to be who you are. The gatekeepers are real, but the gates are often imagined, made of nothing but self-doubt and social scripts handed to us without consent. Even the idea of needing to be chosen is part of this myth, that someone wiser or older or more official must select us before we are worthy of stepping forward. But the most impactful voices in history did not wait to be chosen. They chose themselves in moments of uncertainty, in climates of resistance, in rooms that were not built for them, and in doing so, they reshaped the rooms entirely. They weren't reckless, they weren't ego-driven, they were simply unwilling to accept that their capacity needed to be verified by someone else's approval. They understood what many of us are just beginning to realize, that permission is often a tool used to keep power centralized, to delay progress, to control narratives. And we, especially those who've been historically told to wait the longest, must begin to recognize when it's time to stop asking and start moving. What's even more insidious is how we internalize this myth. It becomes a voice inside our heads, not just outside of us. It tells us, you can't write that. You can't lead that project. You're not ready yet. We begin to censor ourselves before the world ever has the chance to do it. We pre-reject our ideas, we downplay our abilities, and we silence our own brilliance, all because we've bought into the idea that worthiness must first be confirmed. But confirmation never comes in the way we hope it will. The world is too distracted, too invested in its own structures, to pause and hand us a stamp of approval. So we wait. We wait for a voice louder than our own to say yes. We wait for validation that may never arrive. And all the while, the moments pass, the ones that could have been filled with the sound of us beginning. You. From the moment we start becoming aware of ourselves in the world, we are quietly introduced to the idea of the frame. It doesn't look like a prison. It doesn't feel immediately restrictive. In fact, it often comes wrapped in praise. When we're obedient, when we're neat, when we're agreeable, when we're easy to categorize. The frame is made up of expectations, labels, and definitions of success that someone else built before we even had the words to question them. We are told who we should be, not explicitly, but through stories, rules, roles, and praise. We are told how to behave, what is appropriate, what is feminine or masculine, what is ambitious but not too much, what is confident but not arrogant. And while these molds might seem like guidance at first, eventually they reveal themselves for what they are, boundaries placed around our potential. The frame becomes a container. It asks us to be palatable. It demands that we make sense to others before we have even made sense to ourselves. It turns dreams into checklists and questions into silence. It rewards us when we conform and withholds belonging, when we challenge the shape it wants us to fit. And what's most disheartening is that we often try to shrink ourselves to fit inside it, not because we don't know who we are, but because we've been convinced that who we are might be too big, too strange, too loud, or too different to be accepted. We start editing ourselves before the world even asks. We make ourselves smaller, simpler, more familiar, just to be understood by a system that was never meant to see all of us in the first place. This isn't just about identity, though that is where it begins. It's about the way systems of power are built to maintain sameness, to reward predictability, and to suppress discomfort. True individuality threatens structure, and so we're taught to suppress it. We're told there's a right kind of success, a respectable way to exist, a normal pace at which to grow. Anything outside of that becomes suspect. A woman who speaks too assertively is intimidating. A person who chooses their own path is unrealistic. A voice that doesn't follow the rhythm of tradition is too radical. The irony is that the people we most admire, the artists, the thinkers, the leaders, the ones who truly shift culture, are the very people who refuse to fit inside the frame. Yet when it comes to our own lives, we hesitate to follow that same courage. We are afraid to step outside because we've been told that everything worth having exists inside the lines. But no one was born to fit into a structure that doesn't evolve with them. Growth, by its nature, is uncomfortable. Real voice, real identity, real purpose. They are messy, they are contradictory, they change, and they often don't make immediate sense to those who are still operating from outdated rules. That's not a flaw. It's evidence of movement, of life, of original thought. You weren't made to contort your edges to please other people's preferences. You weren't born to be understandable in 10 seconds. You weren't meant to reduce your complexity just to be more likable. The world will always find reasons to ask you to stay small. That's how the frame survives. It feeds off of your hesitation, your doubt, your desire to be accepted. It thrives when you second-guess the fire in your chest, or apologize for your sharpness, or explain away your ambition in a softer tone so others feel more comfortable. Frames are not just external. They live inside us too. They live in the voice that says, "Not yet," the fear that says, "You don't belong here," the instinct that tells you to hold back instead of standing up. And the hardest part is, sometimes, we begin to mistake the frame for protection. It feels safer to be understood than to be questioned. It feels easier to meet expectations than to disrupt them. But what we sacrifice in that safety is authenticity. And no matter how polished or successful we become inside the frame, if we've abandoned the truth of who we are to get there, the cost will always be too high. There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't shout. It doesn't storm into the room and demand to be seen. Instead, it whispers, just loud enough for you to hear it in the quiet moments. You're not good enough. You're not really supposed to be here. You're a fraud, and it's only a matter of time before they find out. This fear is called imposter syndrome, and it thrives not in chaos, but in silence. It grows in the spaces where we don't speak up, where we hide what we don't know, where we pretend we're confident while secretly questioning every decision we make. It doesn't need facts or evidence to survive, just your hesitation, your doubt, and your silence. It's not something we're born with. It's something we learn from systems that don't see us, from standards that weren't built with us in mind, from experiences that tell us success belongs to others, not to people like us. And the cruelest part is how personal it feels, even when it's not. The voice of imposter syndrome sounds like your own, even though it was planted there by everything around you. It gets internalized so subtly that by the time we hear it, we think it must be the truth. We believe we are the only ones feeling it. That belief, that isolation, is the very soil it needs to grow stronger. It convinces you to stay quiet in meetings, to defer to others even when your instincts are right, to say yes when you mean no, to underplay your strengths so no one expects too much of you. It teaches you to perform confidence rather than feel it, and it rewards you when you mask your uncertainty just well enough to pass. The irony is that imposter syndrome doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care how educated you are, how experienced, how respected. Some of the most capable, brilliant people walk through the world with this gnawing voice in the back of their minds, and because they're silent about it, because we're all taught to be, no one knows. We sit in rooms full of self-doubt, pretending we are fine, assuming we're the only ones who are pretending. We think we're the exception. Everyone else has it figured out. Everyone else belongs. It's just us, secretly stumbling through success, terrified that at any moment we'll be exposed as undeserving. And so we remain silent. We don't talk about it because we think it's a sign of weakness. But the silence is the trap. It's what keeps us disconnected, what prevents us from realizing that nearly everyone has had that feeling at some point. The fear of being found out, of not being enough, of being accidentally included in spaces we worked hard to reach. The silence around imposter syndrome is what makes it so powerful. Because when you don't name it, it grows in the dark. It pushes you to overwork, to over-apologize, to constantly prove your worth, not because you want to, but because you think you have to. You start setting yourself on fire just to keep others warm, thinking that maybe if you just do a little more, they'll finally believe you belong. But the truth is, the problem isn't your ability. It's the story you've been told about what ability looks like, who gets to own it, and what it means to be confident. We are taught to associate authority with a certain tone, a certain background, a certain kind of certainty. And if we don't naturally possess those markers, we begin to doubt what we do have, even when it's enough. But silence doesn't just protect the fear, it protects the systems that created the fear in the first place. As long as we're questioning ourselves, we're not questioning the structures around us. As long as we stay quiet, the status quo stays in place. That's why imposter syndrome isn't just a personal issue. It's a cultural one. It's a symptom of environments that reward performance over authenticity, dominance over vulnerability, and tradition over inclusivity. When we break the silence even slightly, we begin to see how much of it was never really ours to carry. When we speak about it out loud, with honesty, without shame, something shifts. Not because the fear disappears, but because it loses its grip. Not because we're suddenly certain, but because we realize uncertainty isn't something to hide. It's something we all carry. And maybe, just maybe, the power was never in being perfectly confident. Maybe it was always in being honest enough to keep showing up, even when we weren't. Rejection has a way of feeling deeply personal, even when we know it's not. It doesn't knock politely or ask if you're ready. It just shows up, often when we care the most. And when it hits, it doesn't just sting in the moment. It echoes. It finds its way into the quiet corners of our confidence and sits there, whispering doubts when no one else is around. It makes us question whether we should have tried in the first place, whether we misunderstood our worth, whether we were foolish to believe we were ready. It can feel like a closed door, like a final verdict, like confirmation of the insecurities we've been working so hard to silence. But what rejection often is, if we can step far enough outside the sting to see it, is not an ending at all. It's a redirection, a course correction, a moment that, while painful, is pointing us somewhere different, and sometimes somewhere better than we imagined. We live in a world that glorifies acceptance, being chosen, being celebrated, being approved of. We're told that success is about yeses. How many people say yes to your ideas, your work, your presence? And so we begin to measure our value through the responses we receive. If they say yes, we're valid. If they say no, we shrink. But rejection is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is not the universe punishing you. Sometimes it's timing. Sometimes it's mismatch. Sometimes it's someone else's limitations being reflected back at you. And sometimes it's exactly what was supposed to happen, because what you were aiming for was too small, too safe, too misaligned with who you're becoming. Rejection forces pause. It creates friction. And friction, as uncomfortable as it is, often signals that growth is close by. What makes rejection so hard to sit with is not just the immediate feeling of failure, but the stories we build around it. We start weaving narratives that we weren't good enough, that we'll never be chosen, that we've hit our limit. These narratives are rarely true, but they are loud, especially when we've placed all our hope into one opportunity, one relationship, one outcome. We become attached to how we think things are supposed to go. And when that version unravels, we interpret it as a loss, rather than as a clearing. But loss isn't always damage. Sometimes it's space being made for something else to take root. Something more honest, something more aligned, something that could not have found you if you were still clutching the thing that said no. There's a different way to look at rejection, not as a punishment, but as information. It teaches us about what we value. It shows us where we might still be seeking validation from places that were never equipped to give it. It reveals what we're willing to fight for, and what, in the end, we might be better off releasing. And in this way, rejection can become a powerful filter, not to test our worth, but to refine our direction. To pull us away from what isn't working, even if we thought it should, and to quietly usher us towards something truer. But for this to happen, we have to be willing to stay with it, to feel the discomfort without letting it harden us, to not rush past the pain, but also not let it define the next step we take. Most of us carry a handful of rejections that, in hindsight, became our turning points. The job we didn't get that pushed us to start something of our own, the person who didn't choose us, making space for the one who truly saw us, the idea that was turned down only to come back stronger, more refined, more real. But we often only see this in retrospect. In the moment, all we feel is the ache, the sharp absence of what we thought would be ours. Still, if we can hold that ache without letting it become bitterness, if we can keep moving with open hands instead of clenched fists, something begins to shift. Rejection can deepen our resilience. It can sharpen our clarity. It can teach us the radical lesson that we are not defined by who accepts us, but by who we decide to become in the face of being told no. From the time we begin to speak, we're taught how to modulate our voices, not just in tone, but in content, in confidence, in direction. We are subtly, and sometimes overtly, shaped to believe that our voice should match the room, that we must blend in before we stand out, that the safest way to be heard is to sound like everyone else. And slowly, our voice, once raw and original and full of instinct, begins to mold itself into an echo. We start repeating the opinions that are already validated, the words that won't get us judged, the truths that feel familiar enough to be palatable. We mimic authority, we mirror expectation, and we silence the parts of ourselves that sound different, not because we don't feel them, but because we've been conditioned to believe that different is dangerous, and loud is arrogant, and honest is unprofessional. But your voice was never meant to be a replica of someone else's approval. It was meant to be an instrument, a living, breathing extension of your insight, your experience, your perception of the world. An instrument is not afraid to hold its own note. It does not apologize for its sound. It does not look around to check if the others are playing the same melody. An instrument creates. It responds. It shapes silence into something meaningful. That is what your voice was designed for, not to imitate, but to interpret. Not to echo, but to express. And when you begin to understand that, you start noticing all the places where you've been holding back, all the rooms where you spoke half-truths instead of full honesty, all the moments where you chose correctness over courage, likability over clarity, safety over depth. The world often praises voices that confirm what we already believe. It rewards repetition, it platformizes certainty, and so it can feel risky, even radical, to speak from a place that hasn't been vetted or softened or made convenient for others to consume. But the most powerful voices are not the ones that echo what's already been said. They're the ones that disrupt rhythm, that add tension, that introduce something unexpected, not for the sake of noise, but because truth, when it's real, doesn't always arrive gently. It demands presence, and presence, true presence, requires that you trust your own sound more than the applause you hope to receive. There's a quiet tragedy in how many brilliant people walk through life holding back their voice, not because they don't have something to say, but because they've been trained to doubt that what they have to say matters. They wait for permission to speak, for the perfect moment to express, for the assurance that they won't be misinterpreted or dismissed or disliked. But there is no perfect moment. There is only now, the moment you decide that your voice is allowed to take up space without needing to prove itself first. When you speak from that place, the place that isn't performance but presence, something changes. You stop looking for a script to follow. You stop asking yourself how others would say it. You stop trying to sound like someone else and begin listening to what is asking to be said through you. Your voice carries your whole life inside it. The lessons, the losses, the questions, the resilience, the rawness, the pieces of you that no one else has lived. That is what makes it sacred. And yet, we spend so much time trying to smooth it out, to make it cleaner, quieter, more professional, more persuasive. We think credibility comes from tone, from formatting, from making sure our ideas fit within the lines of acceptability. But credibility, real credibility, comes from alignment. When what you say and who you are in sync, when your voice doesn't just sound like power but like truth, when you're not just speaking to be heard, you're speaking because silence is no longer an option. And yes, it will be uncomfortable, especially if you've been echoing for a long time. The first time you use your full voice, not the edited version, not the softened one, not the borrowed language or the memorized argument, it might feel like too much, too vulnerable, too intense, too revealing. But that feeling is not wrong. That feeling is the sound of your voice finally being an instrument again, something whole, something resonant, something that cannot be reduced to someone else's approval. The world has never truly belonged to those who waited politely for permission. It has always, quietly and loudly, been reshaped by those who were willing to disrupt the rhythm, challenge the narrative, and risk not being understood before they were accepted. And yet, so many of us are taught to wait, to raise our hands, to be chosen, to ask if it's okay to want more. We learn early that safety lies in approval, that to act without endorsement is to court danger, disrespect, or ridicule. That ambition must be tempered by politeness, and that being bold is only admirable when it's been sanctioned by someone more powerful. But the truth that most systems won't say out loud is that they were not built to reward the bold. They were built to preserve themselves, and preservation rarely makes space for revolution. Still, we hesitate. We internalize the idea that impact belongs to the already validated, the ones with the degrees, the followers, the gatekeepers' blessing. We look at those who move mountains and assume they must have been invited to the table. But if you look closer at the people who shift culture, who awaken movements, who reshape institutions or ideas, what you'll see, more often than not, is a pattern of refusal. A refusal to wait, a refusal to shrink, a refusal to let someone else's comfort dictate the volume of their vision. These people didn't always have a roadmap. They didn't have unanimous approval. What they had was clarity. Not certainty, that's different, but clarity. A felt sense that the thing they wanted to build, say, disrupt, or create was real, even if no one else could see it yet. Boldness doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means the willingness to move through fear without needing it to vanish first. Boldness doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from alignment. When your values and your voice and your vision line up so fully that not acting would be a betrayal of yourself. And this boldness is quiet as often as it is loud. Sometimes it's marching in protest. Sometimes it's saying no in a boardroom. Sometimes it's walking away from something that once made you feel safe, but now keeps you small. Sometimes it's choosing to write, to build, to create, without waiting for someone to tell you you're ready. And it's almost never comfortable, because to be bold is to accept that you might be misunderstood, that you might be criticized, that you might be called naive, unqualified, too much, too soon, too loud. But that is the price of creation, and every great change begins with someone who decided that being seen incorrectly was less painful than not being seen at all. We are so often conditioned to be reactive instead of proactive, to respond to expectations, to answer invitations, to wait for titles before claiming our authority. But the world doesn't need more echoes of permission. It needs more voices willing to speak before they're asked. More builders who start before they have certainty. More leaders who redefine what leadership looks like. If you look back at any major shift in history, in culture, in art, in science, it wasn't started by the person who followed every rule and waited patiently for the nod of approval. It was started by someone who said, in one form or another, "I'm going to do this anyway." That is where the world begins to bend. What keeps most people from stepping into boldness isn't a lack of talent or worth. It's a deeply embedded belief that they're not allowed, that someone else holds the key, that their voice or their work or their story must pass a test before it's allowed to matter. But boldness dismantles that myth. Boldness looks at the locked door and doesn't ask for the key. It kicks it open, or it builds another door, or it walks away entirely and makes something new. And every time someone chooses boldness over waiting, they leave behind a crack in the wall for someone else to follow. Boldness is contagious like that. It wakes up the sleeping parts of others. It whispers, "If they can do it, maybe I can too." That's how the world changes, not just in headlines, but in hearts, in choices, in the everyday decision to stop asking for permission and start acting from purpose.